Good morning. Thank you very much for joining us on this webinar about whether or not the waste diverted from landfill metric is still appropriate in the construction industry. My name's Georgia Elliott-Smith. I am the Managing Director of Element 4, which is a sustainability consultancy based in the UK. We work across the real estate sector for occupiers, for developers, asset managers, investors, and so on, developing corporate sustainability strategies, but also working as sustainability champions on property delivery projects. So with me this morning, I've got two incredible experts who I will introduce in just a moment. But first of all, I'm just going to describe what it is that this session is all about. So thank you everybody for joining us. I think this topic this week for WRAP's UK Recycle Week is really relevant. We know that the construction sector in the UK is the largest user of materials in the country, and it produces the biggest waste stream in terms of tonnage. The 2018 DEFRA waste statistics show that 62% of the total waste produced in England is construction, demolition and excavation waste. Half of that is specifically construction and demolition waste. The remainder is excavation waste, which includes things like dredging. Our Green Future, which is the government's 25-year environment plan, states a target to double resource productivity by 2050. And the government's resource and waste strategy of 2018 also aims to eliminate avoidable wastes of all kinds by 2050. So that's something that we're going to dive into today, talking about whether or not the diverted from landfill statistic is still relevant. We see that across the whole sector, most companies are reporting X% of waste diverted from landfill. It still is the primary metric that is used by most organisations and most projects. So I'm going to be talking to my panellists today about whether or not we think that's relevant, and if it's not, what we think the solution is and where we should be going from here. So I just want to introduce them. First of all, I've got Rembrandt Coppola, who is Director of Research and Innovation at EcoWise, and also Gary Elliott, founder and chief executive of Elliott Wood. So good morning, guys. Nice to see you.
Good morning.
Good morning. Nice to see you. So Rem, first of all, could you introduce yourself, please, and tell us a bit about yourself and what it is that you do?
Thank you, Georgia. I'm Rembrandt. I work for EcoWise, which is a research and innovation and digital services company, and we work on a lot of European projects, some in the built environment, where we work with large construction companies, but also umbrella organizations to help, for example, a project to help SMEs who have innovations to get to the right information they need, or the matchmaking with investments. So we built those digital service platforms, but we also have in the circular economy, we're working on material tracing and digital tracing of any kind of products and supply chains. We also have a project on this called CircThread, and that focuses on, okay, can you create better information services so that the materials that come to the construction sites, that they are digitally logged and that there's a digital logbook of the building. These are the type of research projects we do with a lot of partners in the UK, but also in the wider European sphere. So we're quite well aware of a lot of the recent developments that are upcoming on the legislative side as well. And we do quite a bit of sustainability consulting as well. So that comes from there too. Thank you.
Amazing. Thanks very much, Rem. And Gary, good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, so I'm Gary Elliott. I'm CEO of Elliott Wood. We're principally structural and civil engineers, although we also involved with kind of other aspects like sort of BIM, transportation, and also sustainability is a kind of a key part of our ethos. We've been involved with projects. I mean, we've been going for 27 years or so, so we've been around for a while, and we are part of an industry which I have to say is pretty bad in terms of its kind of whole environmental impact. And I think for many years, I think there's been far too much, kind of greenwashing about, sustainability as a word. Yeah. And I think, what I've seen, I think probably over the last year is the kind of the highest that I've ever seen sustainability on the agenda within the industry. And that's great to see. But I still don't think we're doing anything like enough. And I think the piece that we've been doing I guess, a lot of work on is the potential for reuse of the millions and millions of tons of materials that are already sitting inside our buildings, rather than extracting kind of new resources.
Wonderful.
So I guess the bit that and we produced a document recently with Grosvenor, which actually sits around reuse, and it's called Full Circuitry Reuse, and it's, I guess, a bit of a practical step guide about how you can start to approach the challenges. And there are many, and I'm sure we'll cover a lot of these, the kind of the many challenges that we face in terms of taking materials out, firstly understanding what's there, and then being able to reuse them.
That's great. And so it looks like you and Rem have got a lot in common in terms of how we are logging and enabling the reuse of those materials. And we'll come on to that a bit later. That's great.
Absolutely, yeah.
So first of all, Rem, I want to come to you because when you look, first glance at the government waste statistics, it talks about over 90% of construction and demolition waste is recovered. Could you just give us an idea of what that means? Because that on the face of it sounds fantastic, like we really have nothing else to do.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic, and that is really due to how that's defined. The UK is not unique in this. This is actually something that comes from the EU. So thanks to Brexit, hopefully this can be fixed. So some good things there, and that comes from those statistics are a lot related to backfilling. So you have your rubble and your waste, and you recover them by empty the holes that are on the site, or materials that you place them in those holes or in those areas, backfilling practices, and then you can say it's recovered materials. So there's no clear distinction between materials that are actually sent for recycle and materials that are used on the site for whatever purpose. Of course, it's done in a proper way. It's not meaning that there's no hazardous materials that go in there. But the recovery factor, what is actually recovered and goes into new buildings or new construction materials or lower grade roads, etc. We don't really have the figures for that. And there are efforts to try to address some of this, but it's not going fast enough.
That's really
meaning there's not enough, it's not high enough on the priority of the agenda.
Absolutely. Really I find that very interesting. There's a lot of confusion, I think, around the language of waste and materials. And I think also this is, you mentioned earlier greenwash, Gary, there's a huge amount of greenwash going on because it's sort of in everybody in the project's interests to make it look like this is as green as possible. So that is a real barrier, isn't it, to us actually addressing these topics. So what would you propose then, Rem, is a better sort of definition of the types of the use categories for the materials as they become potentially waste?
Yeah, I think the best definitions are those that are understandable and means that they're action oriented in general. So I think from practice, a really good definition is material sent for recycling as opposed to what's recovered, because recovered could mean anything. If you say sent for recycling, it's someone put it on a lorry and it's sent to a recycling facility. Whether it gets there or not, that's another one. So that's, I think, what's those kind of definition additions are very important. And then also what's sent for reuse. So because there will be a reuse provider that will try, and then you have, of course, the actual reuse recycling. And you can have backfilling, that's fine, but you should just name the apple and the pear. So we need to further distinguish and create further categories in that schema, taking into account also the practicalities, of course. How do we measure this properly and make that simple enough that the SMEs in the construction sector, because they're mostly small SMEs, can also handle this information and deal with it. And that's where digital solutions potentially come in, but there needs to be more support for that to make it easy.
Yeah, and there definitely needs to be a common definition, so that, because what we tend to find, Gary, isn't it right, that across different systems that we use, different main contractors, even different organizations, have a different way of recording use categories for materials.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the biggest problem is the kind of confusion between recycling and reuse. I think people think that sort of recycling is good in some way, and I think if we take the journey of a piece of steel, for example, that's being recycled, what happens is demolition contractor goes in, takes out a piece of steel, cuts it up into little pieces, it goes into a skip, it gets taken off, transported off, it gets melted back down again and gets recast into a piece of steel. So that's the process. That process is very energy. It uses a huge amount of carbon. It uses a huge amount of energy in that process. So it seems pretty obvious that if you can take that piece of steel out whole, don't cut it up, don't send it off for remelting and reuse it, you've cut out a whole journey. Not just in terms of the physical journey of sort of getting from A to B, but also the amount of carbon that's generated in the remelting process. So it seems obvious, and I think the real challenge I think that we have in the industry is changing mindsets from thinking that sort of second hand is second best. I mean, a piece of steel that's been inside a building for 20 years is still a piece of steel, and as long as it's been reasonably well maintained, it's no different to a new piece of steel. So,
right.
Fundamentally, that piece of steel, if you can extract it in an undamaged way, and that is a challenge, then there's no reason why it can't be reused in a new building. And this is something that we've been looking at, and we're not the only ones. There are obviously people in the industry that are looking at this. We are looking at projects at the moment where buildings are being demolished, and you have to kind of question whether that's the right move in the first place, in terms of the hierarchy. But on the assumption that it is being demolished, can those materials be taken out? Can they be kind of reprocessed, recertified, and then brought back into the system almost as a new piece of steel, with all of the issues around warranties kind of resolved? And I think that has to be the direction of travel, and it's not going to be possible for everything. We know from experience and other projects that some elements you just simply cannot extract in a way that's suitable for kind of direct reuse. But I think it's got to be the ambition. And I suppose the work that we've been doing with Grosvenor is really to then start to think, well, how can we start to understand what's inside our buildings? We can't plan for reuse in the future if we don't know what's inside our buildings. So part of the starting point of the journey of the potential for reuse is to actually look at in detail the kind of buildings before it even becomes a project, ideally, so that when you start something, you kind of know what's inside there and you know what the reuse potential is. And that's the kind of, I suppose, the piece that I think is largely missing. Yes. Alongside also at the kind of the second-hand market for construction structural materials is kind of non-existent at the moment. So I think there has to be a mechanism for this to happen, and we all know it'll be expensive and it'll be challenging to start with, but as this starts to become sort of more commonplace, so obviously the cost base will come down.
So I think that you touched on something really interesting there, which is about the kind of drivers for this. Now, I mean, we know about construction projects and the way that they typically run. In terms of the appetite for this sort of project, I want to ask both of you, I think, first of all, Rem, what is it in terms of policy and regulation at the moment, and potentially financial issues at a national and international level, that mean that reuse really isn't a thing at the moment? And, any comments on that about what we think we need to see change?
Yes, I think that big problem is there's no drivers in the policy. So not even soft drivers, meaning there's targets, but they're not really hard targets. There are no consequences. So there's not even that. At least not in the UK. There are increasingly, not in England. In Wales, there are increasingly some drivers on reuse. This is more related not to the construction sector, but more to appliances. But there is kind of some more lessons that can be learned from reuse practices, and also metrics. So metrics in terms of for example, the amount of reuse per person per year in kilos. There are metrics in certain countries as kind of trying to form a system, and you can apply that to buildings. You can say, okay, we want for new buildings to have X% of reuse. Could start with 2%. 2% of reuse for materials per year in 2025 or 2028, or whatever in consultations the sector decides is something that's reasonably feasible. And that would start to drive the whole system, because if you put it on the driver for new build construction of a certain size, meaning a certain million amount of building, because otherwise you have first the big construction companies have to start with this. because that's how it needs to move forward. It's too complicated for small companies.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, how you can really set up the system. And then that creates a market. That creates a market for reuse materials. And that then creates the companies that are willing to do this, but they currently cannot because like what the works that Gary is posing is great. But at the moment, it's very difficult to convince selling secondary steel, having a company that creates a quality grading system for you because there's no market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it really starts with that. How do we look at a new build construction building? And can we introduce legislative targets around percentage reuse and percentage recycling of that building?
That's great. And can you just tell me, because I don't know, which countries are we talking about when we say that setting an example for reuse?
For buildings, I don't think there is a good example. The UK can be the world leading this time,
hey,
as they like to be.
Okay,
there are examples for appliances. In Belgium and Spain, there are legislative proposals for appliances, but not for construction, demolition material reuse, and in that new build site.
Yeah, and I have heard that France has introduced a recyclability index as well, haven't they, on products that consumables and I believe furniture, things like that, where you have to rate the product from 1 to 10, I think, for how recyclable it is. Now, that's obviously not reuse, but it's a movement, isn't it?
Correct.
Yeah. Gary, in terms of a construction project, what do you see as being the primary obstacles really at the moment, the way that typical projects are run?
I think it's the usual kind of issues of perception. I think is a really big one, but I think it's also the concern about cost and quality and assurance and warranties, insurance. It's all those kind of usual things I think that come in, and I think all of those, in my view, are surmountable. I think we can deal with all those sort of technical aspects, but I think the one that's really difficult to deal with is the kind of perception.
Right.
And how do we overcome that? And I think the only way really to do that, it's a slow process. I think you have to just do projects. And we're looking at some, and the easiest way of kind of taking projects and reusing materials is to kind of almost work within projects where you have both sets within one client base. So you have a building that's coming down and you have a building that's going up. And again, you have to kind of question, fundamentally whether it's the right decision to be taking a building down. And I think the starting point is absolutely on that hierarchy about, do nothing is the best thing you can possibly do, and sort of work down. And eventually, if you really can't keep the building, then if demolition is the only option, let's make sure that material is taken out and reused then in a new construction. And that is something that we are actively working on at the moment. I'd love to be able to sit here and say that we've done it on a big scale, but it was certainly in progress. We're looking at one particular project at the moment where all of the steelwork, we think, from one building can be taken out and reused in another new building, which otherwise would have been using new steelwork.
Wow.
And the measure for that for us is looking at the embodied carbon aspect of the new structure. So we can massively pull down the amount of embodied carbon in the new building by obviously reusing the steelwork. And that pulls you down well below any targets that are being set at the moment by the likes of Letty. And so
that's very interesting. So carbon there is the driver.
The carbon becomes the driver, and I think increasingly we are seeing sort of legislation. I'm not sure how much teeth it really has, but legislation through the planning process. So the requirement for sort of hitting various targets. I worry about the ability for planning to kind of control what happens later down the process. So whilst you have to kind of go this through planning, the sort of terms like sort of best endeavours come into the terminology that kind of goes, well, I'll try my best, but if I couldn't quite achieve it, well, so what? So I think, excuse me, I think those are things that I think have to be really tightened up if we're going to really, so that, the things that are required of planning actually have to be then taken through the construction process, because there's not really a link there at the moment.
Absolutely, yeah. I think, and there's some really interesting work going on at the moment, isn't there? I mean, your work with Grosvenor, which I'll ask you a little bit more about that in a moment, but there's also the Green Construction Board released targeting zero avoidable waste in construction. Yeah. But again, there is, and the report acknowledges that there is a real problem here with language, because when you talk about avoidable waste and residual waste, it's really, what is the definition of that? And I think in the same way that, you know, the Letty movement has happened, I think we as professionals in the industry need to kind of be the grown-ups in the room, and we need to start devising our own definitions and creating pilot projects and case studies that seek to drive the regulators to a particular conclusion before, you know, waiting for them to catch up and give us that definition.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it is quite interesting within planning, actually, certainly in some of the London boroughs and the city, I think, are probably leading on this. It's not just about obviously reducing carbon, but it's also thinking about how we might be able to deconstruct our buildings better in the future. And you know, part of the barrier at the moment, as I mentioned, is about not having the information about what's in our buildings.
Right.
Ideally, in the future, we will know exactly what's in our buildings because we'll have material passports. And so every building effectively becomes a material store, you know, rather than it being a building. And that starts to impact on the way that you construct now. So designing for deconstruction in the future, I think, is a really key measure, so that in 50 to 60 years' time, you know, when we come to remove buildings or replace them or do whatever, actually those materials can be simply reused and extracted much more easily with the full knowledge of what's inside them.
Absolutely. So can you then, so moving on to the solutions then, can you tell us about materials passports? Can you tell us, I'll ask each of you, because Rem, this is part of your work too, isn't it? Tell us about how we can use design and data to enable greater reuse in future. So first of all, Rem, can I come to you and what you're doing in your work?
Yeah, so the exactly the view. So there's two aspects of this. One is kind of almost getting old, although it's still not wide practice. It's 15 years old. It's building information modeling. Gary mentioned it briefly, where you have tried to create an inventory, a digital replica of your building with 3D scanning technologies, and you then create for every component a kind of an itemized list. It's a bit like I try to call it a shopping list. It's not like that, but you have a list of things and you know where they are in the building and what they represent. And then that can be linked, in theory, that's not yet done, with something what's a material passport. So the manufacturer or supplier makes their brick, makes their sheet, makes their plasterboard. They have a specification list sheet. They already have this in a PDF, but you want to digitize that so that it can be linked and that it can be commonly understood. Okay, this is plasterboard, and it can be machine readable. The computer can understand it. So that you can then attach that to your building information model, and you can store that for future purpose. And then maybe 30 years later, when there's a big renovation, or maybe 60 years later, when that building is knocked down, you can retrieve that and you can see, okay, what's in this plasterboard? What's in that? There's a brick. How much brick is there? How much steel? What kind of quality? What alloy? Etc. 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 That's the theory.
Yes.
There's a few hurdles that we see in building information modeling. One is the cost. And especially for smaller companies and the ease of doing these things. And to create, and then the challenge there is also for existing buildings. This is even more costly because of the renovation, kind of the size of the contracts. And the second part is this whole concept of digital material passports or resource passport is new. So there will be a legislative proposal from the European Commission probably in December this year or January this year. I don't know if any similar activities in the UK, but I think the UK is still working out a lot of Brexit things, but I have no doubt that they will embrace this, given the construction sector here is world leading initiatives on building information, the modeling, they're one of the best. So there will be similar initiatives here as well. With the timing, I'm not aware, but Gary probably knows more about the UK side of this than me.
Yeah, great. I mean, Gary, you know, your experiences and how we're going to make this a reality.
Yeah, I think BIM is a very kind of misunderstood acronym. I think everybody thinks of BIM as being a three-dimensional drawing, effectively, and and in some senses that is what it is. But actually, it's the data that's embedded in the model that's actually the important part. And I think it's fair to say that the construction process is a very fragmented process, and so the way, ideally in an ideal world, the way that BIM should work is that the BIM model is generated and it's then taken on, that BIM model is taken on all the way through the process, right the way through to the kind of the end user and then beyond. So that the ultimate aim is to have one model that kind of it contains everything, every part, all of the kind of the mechanical and the electrical information that's contained inside the building. We're not there yet. I mean, there's a lot of progress, I think, but to have that fully integrated approach is definitely the kind of where we should be aiming, but it's certainly not there yet. The creation, I think, of a digital twin makes a huge amount of sense, both in terms of the construction process, but then also the user experience at the end. And I think, I could talk for hours on this because there's so many sort of challenges about, you have to know at the beginning what you want to get out of it at the end to make it meaningful and useful. And I think, the process can very quickly become so complex that actually it just becomes meaningless. So, part of the drive that we've been doing is trying to simplify it so that actually it becomes usable, making sure that you get the right data that goes into the model at the kind of beginning of the process, so that actually it's usable at the end of the process. But then making sure that as each stage of the project goes through, everybody takes on that model. What happens at the moment, if you take again a steel frame, for example, what happens is we do a BIM model, it gets passed on to a contractor, and then the steel fabricator basically does their own model, because they don't have the trust. And this is partly to do with liabilities. It's a big chunk of it. This is to do with liabilities, and that kind of has to be, I think, resolved as part of this. We need to think differently about the way that we approach things, so that those kind of liability issues don't become a massive blocker to being able to kind of get the system to work appropriately.
So can we ask that? So it's great to see a couple of questions have popped up. To those who are listening, please do pop your questions in the chat box, and we'll come to those in a moment. But Gary, these problems do need to be resolved. So we're starting jobs today, new jobs are in concept stage right now. What can clients do? What can designers do today to get started in the right way? What can they reference? Who can they talk to? How do we do it?
Yeah, I think the starting point on every project is kind of getting the right people in the room at the right time, and far too often, the right people don't get involved until the kind of project's already set. So we've already gone down a direction where you kind of know what you want to do, and therefore the opportunities for doing things better has already gone. Mm-hmm. So again, part of the piece that we did with Grosvenor was actually about trying to get intelligent information. The inventories that you've been talking about, getting the information ideally in sort of model format, almost before you even start looking at the project. So that you have that data as a starting point, so that you can start to make decisions about the sort of the feasibility of being able to reuse. And I think there's definitely a move. We all know that sort of there's a move towards kind of reusing buildings rather than just knocking them down. So that focus again has to be the starting. The best, as I said before, the best thing to be doing on any project is nothing. That's not great for us in the construction industry, but that is, from a sustainability perspective, that is the best thing. Clearly, that doesn't work in many instances, and we have to kind of work through. So there's that hierarchy of reuse on-site, reuse off-site if you can't do that. And really, the sort of the final version should be, diversion to recycling. It should be the lowest form. And I think, again, sort of twisting this idea or changing the idea from recycling as being good. And I'm not saying it's bad. It's better than landfill. Clearly for most materials. But I think it's resetting that and saying that actually the primary issue should be about reuse of the materials. And I think the bit that then comes into it, it's about then thinking about the construction techniques for building buildings of the future, is making sure that they are not composites, so that they can be disassembled, and thinking about how you can build so at some point in the future they can be disassembled, because that's a massive challenge. For example, with reinforced concrete buildings at the moment, it's very difficult to disassemble them and reuse those elements at their highest level. There are methodologies for doing that with concrete, but it's not, most of the buildings that we're working on, and refurbishing, for example, the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s buildings, a lot of those are reinforced concrete and are exceptionally difficult to, obviously we can reuse them in situ, but to take parts out, elements out and reuse them elsewhere is actually extremely difficult.
Although Rem, you did mention something, not reuse, but a recycling of the concrete back into new cement.
Yeah.
You mentioned,
yeah. There are quite like the best example I think is in the UK, existing example, which is highly recycled, is plasterboard, and the reason for that is that it's illegal to landfill it. So There are large recycling facilities. There are other reasons. It's easier to collect, etc., etc. But but there are lots of initiatives on cement, so you can create what's called recycled cement paste, and there are now tests being done by big cement manufacturers where they use that in existing clinker production, and it feeds back into the cement loop, which large demonstration tests. So that's feasible technologically, or becoming feasible technologically. Whether it's feasible economically is another question. So this is the whole question, and that relates to, I think, a lot of the hurdles. I mean, it's really great to have Gary here to tell about the practical on-site issues, but also the designer aspects. It's like, how easily do you get the cement bricks in the right form out of the building? How quickly can you get it to a factory that can put it into a paste, and then you need to transport it, because you need to get it in a form that it's quite homogeneous as well, probably. And then you start to think about, okay, what we need to have is, and there's also solutions we're working on containerized on-site solutions that can grind things, so you don't have as much transport costs. So you can then deploy them. Okay, we have a deconstruction. We should shift from demolition to deconstruction. We still call it demolition. The wrong term gives the wrong frame of mind. It should be deconstruction, because it's also about practices. How do you get things out so that they're almost directly reusable, ideally, and if they're not, how do you get them into that recycling stream? But so there are quite a lot of technological efforts that have been tried at different scales, and usually they're not carried forward because of the economics of it, or because of, okay, then the funding ends, the research funding ends, etc. And this is one of the tricky parts. It's there's no, as far as at the moment, there's no specific focus program. There's no specific focus innovation program to move this forward. There's no specific program of large demonstration pilots, meaning that we have, for example, for carbon capture and storage. We have 4 huge demonstration programs now going to happen in the UK and industrial parks, but we should have similar programs for deconstruction of buildings, and not just one building, but let's take that as, and have some flagship projects where we can bring those solutions, test them in practice, bring in smart minds, Gary, yourself, Georgia, others, I'm sure in the audience, to work on this, and then at the same time have those legislative drivers that can pull that to a higher level, to a sector-wide level, in a transition phase.
Absolutely, people I find in construction are very conservative, and I think across all industries, apart from maybe software, are very conservative and simply want to continue doing what they've done because it's risk-free. And I think there are already so many risks and challenges within the construction process that adding to that seems like an enormous hurdle. But I agree, Gary, with what you say. Getting experienced teams in with the right mindset is always, for me, the first challenge, because I think some of these ideas, although they're technically feasible, I've sat in numerous meetings where great ideas and innovations are proposed at the outset, and people go, or and it's almost in that moment it's ruled out before it's even explored. So I think I suppose what we're looking for is clients, big clients as well, who have potentially the time and the funds and the potentially more mature and potentially innovative teams around them who work on a lot of projects that are willing to invest the time to do these sorts of pilots.
I think that's right, and I think actually that as I said earlier on, I think that there has been a big shift. I think a lot have signed up to 2030 net zero carbon target, and I think I have certainly seen a complete mind shift, certainly in the sort of the big central London developers, I think, and that's great. And it is with those that we are, I suppose, looking at some of these opportunities. I'd just like to say that just talking about mindset, I suppose. We during our bit of research, we talked to a number of demolition contractors, and demolition contractors for years have been actually taking materials out. Obviously, they have a value, and then sort of recycling effectively those materials. We asked the question to a couple of demolition contractors about why do you cut up the bits of steel into small pieces and put them in a skip? Why don't you take them out whole? And their answer was because nobody's asked us to. which I thought was kind of quite an extraordinary. It's quite an extraordinary kind of. I suppose this just kind of highlights the sort of the challenge that we face is that it's certainly possible to do all these things, and it's actually possible to do it potentially without really any cost uplift, because they've got to lift that piece of steel out anyway, put it on the ground before they cut it up. So it's actually a process they go through. Yes, they might have to extract it a bit more carefully. They might have to do things that allow it to be separated from some of the other elements that are kind of cast potentially around it. But it's certainly possible to do. And I think we just need to think about asking those questions. And I think those are the things that need to kind of get built into the design process right from day one. So that becomes a part of the project. And yes, of course, there are always going to be kind of financial downsides initially when you start doing this stuff, because it's not en masse. There's no sort of critical mass. But in time, it will, as this starts to become more commonplace, and as material costs are going up and materials are getting more difficult to get hold of, I think that actually the economics of this will start to shift. And I think, particularly if you've got clients like the project I mentioned earlier, if you've got a client that owns one building that they're demolishing, and then they've taken that steel and putting it into a new building. Yes, there's a bit of extra cost to actually demolish or to deconstruct that building, but you've saved a whole load of money and carbon on the new building. So there's a massive benefit there, both from a cost perspective and a carbon perspective, if you look at it in the round, if you look at it in the whole.
I think one thing that's really important is capturing these lessons then that we can share, because I also feel one of the things about the construction industry is we tend not to let people see our homework. We are quite protective of the innovations on one project or with one particular client, not transferring them and sharing them widely. So could you point us to some resources where people can really read up about this and get some more information about how they might do it?
Just to say that the reuse document we have shared, which is available on our website or on the Grosvenor website. So it's not an advert, but just go in there, download it if you want to look at the steps to reuse. We also, through the iStruct actually issued our own carbon tool as well. So again, that's for anybody to download and use, and it's intended to be a tool that allows better decisions to be made. So it's not intended to be a kind of an accurate calculation necessarily of the carbon within buildings. It's allowing you to compare different options and therefore make better decisions. And that's part of the kind of process. So there's just a couple of things that we've been directly involved with that I think are probably useful to download. And we've tried to make those all open to everybody to use, particularly because of that very point. And we try to put our money where our mouth is a bit. That's
excellent. Thanks very much, Gary. And I'm just going to go to some questions that are being asked by people at the moment. There's some really good ones in here. Justine, hi Justine, is asking, is BREEAM being updated to include more relevant metrics? Well, we did actually contact BRE in advance of this just to get some information about it. We haven't actually had a response on that, but I do feel like these tools like BREEAM are really powerful for driving behaviour change, because it's something out there. I think the waste diverted from landfill metric actually is, it still is contained within BREEAM, and I think because it's in BREEAM, people think that is, a win, as a tick box. I think that the BREEAM tool could definitely be used to drive the right kind of metrics. I do know that they have forums where people can contribute to the development of the BREEAM tool, so I think that's something for the rest of the the audience and potentially us to engage with. I also want to make a point.
Yeah. So I was just going to say, Georgia, there is actually a change to it, I believe, which is for responsible sourcing. It's in Matto 3, so I think that is a change that has come or is coming. So
you're right. So more circular economy. Yeah. You are right. So I think in terms of waste and reuse, these tools definitely need our engagement, and to really engage and understand with them. Of course, one of the things about those is that you don't necessarily have to achieve those credits if you're going for a BREEAM certification. So I think a flag for all of us to focus more on those credits and use them would be good. Another one, again, another point from Justine, which I'm just going to linger on this because I like it very much. Maybe encouraging diversity would help to shift mindsets. So, I certainly would like to see more women, more people from different backgrounds and cultures and countries, involved in our teams, in our decision makers. And I do think that would help to shift mindsets and ask questions about the way things are done. Thank you for making that point. Gary, this question here from Halusi. In fit out, we have a number of projects with internal staircases, which tend to be steel and often the highest embodied carbon component. We want to move to full timber staircases, but are advised in a commercial setting that this is a challenge. Any experience of successes with timber staircases?
Yes, I could talk for hours on this. I'll try and keep this. So there is a whole lot of work going on timber. So not just timber staircases actually, but timber buildings. So we are currently working on a very large commercial building where we're using timber as the floor system. So it is a hybrid structure. There are significant challenges with it because the building regulations fundamentally kind of require that the structure is non-combustible. And that clearly presents a challenge for timber. That is something that we have challenged, and we have gone through that process, and we have come out the other side with building control approval for a building that is made of timber, principally made of timber, on the basis that the timber still maintains its structural integrity, despite the fire, through a process of charring, effectively, which self-protects the timber. So. I think the answer is that you can definitely do timber in commercial buildings. It is definitely a more complicated process to go through. You have to take, again, it comes back to kind of starting right from the beginning and getting everybody kind of aligned and on board. But I would wholeheartedly say, and I think there are examples actually of CLT buildings, commercial CLT buildings that have been done with timber stairs. So I would say you just have to kind of get the right people in the room at the early stages of the project.
Yeah, I know that the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products is currently supporting a report to COP26 on the introduction of more CLT into construction. So that's definitely one to watch. If you go to the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products and take a look at what they're doing, then that might help inform you as well. But yeah, I agree that there are these systemic issues around insurance and risk that we really need to tackle.
Now, fire has been a massive issue. Fire is a kind of massive issue at the moment, clearly, for obvious reasons. And,
of course,
and again, it's the perception of timber. Well, timber burns, doesn't it? And actually not really the depth of understanding about how it is still a suitable material for use in those kind of situations. So. I completely agree. There's lots of blockers that need to be overcome. But,
well, I think on that, I'd like to come to Rem, because Rem, obviously I know you very well from a campaigning background and a lobbying background. We met just last week with the Mayor of London to talk about waste incineration, and on that, I think it's very easy for all of us to sort of navel gaze a little bit and just look at the problems that we're facing on our own, on our particular projects, without necessarily thinking about the influence that we might be able to bring to bear on policymakers and professional institutions, insurers, and so on. Could you just speak a little bit about your experiences of lobbying and about how we in industry might actually affect the sorts of changes that we need to see in policy? That's putting you on the spot a little bit, sorry.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's an important question, and it's yeah. So I first think I also would like to just say that shifting with more diversity in the construction sector is very important and would definitely make it less conservative in my perspective. I think that's an important point to resound again, which means more panels, more diverse panels to start with in events and all these kind of things, more representation of women and groups. Now back to the policy question. I think the key challenge is priority. Always like there's this theory of policy streams. It's a political theory, and I think it's to an extent accurate. It's like what is on the height of the priority of the agenda, and that's where more activist-oriented efforts or more broader coalitions of lobbyists can come in. Is to put things to try to form pressure so that issues around reuse, for example, let's tackle reuse, that it becomes higher on the priority of the agenda, and also that there's sufficient kind of sparks in the eyes of the politicians of the potential of it, because there's a huge potential, especially for a country like the UK, which has to import most of its materials. And so economically, there's a huge amount of potential benefit. from an economy-wide perspective, and that's on the political area very important. So I think that's the key question: is how do you get a sufficient group of coalition of politicians, and how do you get a sufficient group of companies to really start pushing this, as well as the public organization, so that it becomes high up on the agenda, so that there is starting to form legislative proposals or other initiatives in that direction. But it first has to go on the agenda in the high priority, and not somewhere on page 30 in the resources of waste strategy, or page 25, or wherever down below it's in the page in the paragraph.
Yeah, I love what you say. And I think that all of us who are looking at these issues need to understand that behind the scenes are conversations going on about priorities. And I think the brilliant thing about activism, lobbyists, you know, whatever you want to call it, but actually dealing with the higher regulatory level, is that they really respond to whoever shouts the loudest and wherever they think they'll gain political benefit, and also looking at how strategies and policies may be aligned with longer term goals. Then I think that there's also a real problem in politics of joined up thinking across different departments. So we very often see, you know, issues with Treasury, you know, where there's VAT relief on building new. You know, an unintended consequence of that is that it does not help with the environmental objectives of trying to minimise carbon and so on. So where we're at the sharp end dealing with those things, it's really important that we then confront our policymakers, the civil servants and the politicians with what we're discovering on the ground and our suggestions for improvement. So, you know, I think, do we know what our institutions, our professional institutions, who all have policy leads, you know, do we know what they are saying to our MPs and policymakers? I'm not sure, you know, I think probably everybody on the call would be a member of some form of professional institution. I wonder whether we know what conversations are being had and whether we are party to them. I mean, Gary, you and I have talked about lobbying before. Is that something that, I know that's something you're quite interested in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, definitely interested. I think, again, I've seen a sort of a massive shift, I think led by a number of sort of key people within our institution, the Institution of Structural Engineers. You know, I would say probably over the last 2 years, it's, you know, every single bit of, well, not every single, but an awful lot of the sort of publications that are coming out are sitting all around, you know, how we can do things better, which is obviously great. And there's definitely lobbying going in from our institutions to try and sort of improve that. I'd love to be able to say I know exactly what the outcomes of those are, but I don't at the moment. But I do know that it's very, very high on the agenda. And obviously part of that was the work that we did with the institution in terms of trying to get out, you know, the idea of just reducing carbon and having a tool that that allows you to kind of be able to calculate it and use it as a methodology for, you know, hopefully bringing that down. But I mean, this is where we need to go. I mean, you know, you without getting too sort of political, I mean, you kind of heard what Boris said recently, and you kind of think, really? You know, it's just like, it's just so sort of jumping on the bandwagon, isn't it? And kind of you know, I don't know. I think the institutions could always do more, and I think, you know, they obviously need to be having those detailed conversations at a high level. And but the agenda has changed, I think, which is good. I mean, I think it's definitely changed.
Yeah. So first thing, I need to say goodbye to Rem, who needs to leave us. I'm afraid we have overrun slightly. I forgot that this was 45 minutes rather than an hour. So thank you for joining us, Rem. So yeah, if you need to head off, then just disappear.
Thank you all. Yeah, I unfortunately have to go. So thank you all, and I'm very happy to be in correspondence about this topic more and more in the future and support the cause.
That's wonderful. Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Rem. Speak to you later. Gary, I do still have a couple more questions for you from the panel, which I think are really important in terms of practicality. So Gerald Morgan has asked, how much opportunity does off-site modular construction offer to meet better reusability?
Yeah, I think the the real benefits of off-site are the kind of reduction in waste. I think that is a fact. It's that, you know, obviously if you're building in a factory, the quality and the planning means that you can design everything around sort of modular sizes that are already produced. I mean, the classic case is, you know, sheets of plasterboard. And if you can actually design to the size of a sheet of plasterboard, then it means you're not wasting it. You're not cutting off pieces and throwing it away. So that's a very simple kind of example. So I'm a huge fan of modular and volumetric construction. You know, we're working in that field. We're working with a number of clients and designing actually for factories, which is obviously good. I think looking at the materials you use is clearly important in terms of the embodied carbon of those materials, because that is a key factor. So clearly using timber is going to give you better benefits than using steel. In those, clearly there are limitations on materials, depending on size and scale of buildings. So that needs to be obviously considered. But I do think that volumetric. But I also think you've got to think of things. You've got to think of things kind of holistically. So you've also got to consider if you're moving sort of whole units, volumetric units, you're moving a lot of air as well. So you've got to look at the transportation costs in that as well. And so arguably sort of flat pack installation using sort of modular systems, but not necessarily volumetric, can be beneficial because you can just transport a lot more, far fewer transportation journeys are needed in that kind of fabrication. So definitely a place for it. I'd say the biggest benefit in terms of reduction of waste in the processing. You don't have the same levels of waste that you get from on-site construction. But there are limitations, obviously, of its use and the forms.
Well, I think environmentally, I mean, there are so many other benefits as well. I mean, you're removing squashy bodies and wet trades, much more from site, and so pollution incidents and noise and so on potentially are much more improved. So it does have to be the future, and I think
but you also have to make sure that you're not causing the same problems as you get on site by gluing everything together. So it's thinking about building these things so they can be deconstructed as well. I mean, there's no point in having a modular system that can't itself be deconstructed with the materials kind of reused. So I think that needs again a sort of a fundamental thought needs to go into that whole part of the process if you're going to do that.
Yeah, I know the Construction Innovation Hub is doing a lot of work. I spoke with them at an event this week. They're doing a lot of work on modular construction, so that might be a good resource for people to go and visit. And another question, this comes up quite a lot when we talk about reuse, from Phidias, Leonida. Design for disassembly, there's a danger this creates too many aesthetic and functional limitations and we end up with kit buildings. Could the complexities of adhering to these principles stifle innovation? And we get this from interior designers as well around reuse of fit out elements, that clients love fashion, they love trends, they love the aesthetics of buildings. What do you think about that?
I think you could look at it as a negative or a positive, and I think with these new constraints, if you like, there are new challenges and new opportunities, and I think I don't think it should stifle. I think it creates greater opportunities in a way to be just a bit more lateral in the way that you think about things. So I turn it on its head and say it's a constraint if you want to look at it as a constraint, or you actually look at it as an opportunity to do things better and to do things differently. And my experience is that actually, we are in the UK. I think we are pretty innovative. I think we are able to kind of solve all sorts of problems, and designing amazing buildings that can be disassembled. I just see that as an opportunity, really. You're absolutely right. This is what I say. It's a design challenge. Yeah. We are designers, and this is a new design challenge. It's not designing by Pinterest. It's designing right to the core of the design problem. It's quite exciting, I think. Yeah. I think it is.
And the experiences that I've had of being involved in projects that do these sort of innovative approaches, it feels great. It's such a great story to be able to tell, and people, especially if you can communicate that with the users of the building, the ongoing tenants, they love that. And
I think there's a real, and I think one of the things that's being talked about a lot, actually at the moment, is the kind of value of these things going forwards, and if we sort of push forward 5 years to projects that we're looking at, starting off at the moment, what are tenants and purchasers going to be looking for in 5 years' time? The whole movement around reuse and using sort of better materials is not going to go backwards. It is only going to go forwards, and it's going to become more and more challenging. And if you're selling a building in 5 years' time, or you've got tenants that want to go in, they're going to be asking these questions. They're going to want to know what's gone into it, what are the true environmental credentials that have been adopted on this building.
Yes.
And if you haven't thought about that, if you haven't got one that's thought about that, I think you're going to be in a very difficult position in 5 years' time.
I do as well. I absolutely agree with you. I know we're in something of an echo chamber. We wouldn't be on the same panel if we didn't agree. Although I was on a panel last night with somebody from the oil and gas industry, so I'm not always on panels with people I agree with. But yeah, I think there's a really interesting point that I have just now completely forgotten. What was the point you made? Remind me.
I don't know. I've forgotten too. It's obviously time.
It's obviously time to come to a close. Yeah, I think what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to finish. I mean, there's somebody asking questions, Nasheen Akrami. Thank you so much for a couple of questions. I think actually we've covered quite a lot of what you've said here about posing the question more widely about why are we building new, and I think that's a really good point for us to sort of start to conclude on. Gary, these fundamental questions being asked at the beginning of a project, should we build new? What's your experience of that?
Well, as I said, I think it's shifted. I think, and that is being shifted by policy. I think it's also being shifted by funding, actually. So the ESG requirements from funders, I think that is starting to kind of, drive this through, and obviously the aspirations to hit net zero carbon, I think by institutions and sort of companies is definitely driving change. But I still think, I think the point of this was to kind of look at how we kind of initially diverted materials from landfill kind of into recycling. And for me, it's now how do we actually shift it from kind of recycling to reuse? And I think for me, that's perhaps the sort of the underlining point of this. It's a shift in mindset from, and understanding, I think, the difference between recycling and reuse, because they are fundamentally different things. And how do we actually think much more fundamentally right at the beginning of a project about how we can reuse, whether that's reusing an existing building, or whether it's reusing the materials on that building, or whether it's bringing in materials that have come from other sites into a new building. There's lots of different ways of doing it. But as I said earlier, there are kind of massive benefits in terms of using materials that have already exist over pulling more and more sort of new resources out of the earth. So.
Yeah, I agree. Resource efficiency is where it's at, and there does need to be a big education on this. And I think particularly, the sorts of projects that you are involved in, the case studies from those will be really valuable for sharing. So somebody's already shared in the chat a link to the guidance that's on your website, the structural tool, and also there is the reuse information from the project. And I know if you go to the Grosvenor website, they have lots of information on there in their materials reuse initiative section about materials passports and so on. So that's a great resource. I'd also like to just do a little promo for the Circular Economy Institute certificate in built environment circularity, which we just launched a couple of weeks ago. So if you go to the website of the Circular Economy Institute, there is some information there for a bit more learning. Justine's on in the audience, and I worked with her on that. And also, I think the starting the conversation, I think all of us at concept stage need to be having this conversation about reuse in a way which is really meaningful, rather than allowing it to be dismissed at first stages. I think collecting information and remembering that we're all on a journey, none of this is perfect, but recording our experiences, recording the data and sharing it with others is so valuable through case studies. So please, get in touch with the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. They are looking at CLT. There's so many organisations involved in this, and the iStructy as well are involved. So I think that's a really good place to finish. In terms of our discussion about diverting waste from landfill, I think we have roundly agreed across the panel that it's time for a rethink of that metric. I really liked what Rem said before as well about the, thinking about using a cent for recycling, cent for reuse metric instead of recycled, and remembering to be a bit suspicious about the language of waste, about recovery, not necessarily meaning that something has been upcycled or even maintained in use. So yes, I think we will leave it there. We're going to continue this conversation with the BRE and BREEAM, talking about how we can bring these metrics into measurement in construction. But yes, if you'd like to get in touch with us, Element 4, we are at element4.co.uk. That's element and the number 4. And Gary, what's your website? And do you want to share your email address if people want to get in touch?
Yeah, sure. It's elliottwood.co.uk, and mine is g.elliott@elliottwood.co.uk.
Fantastic. Thank you everybody for listening in, and thank you for your time. Have a great day. Take care.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Gary. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.